precinct was inhabited by a number of Dutchmen, probably refugees, some of whom were making their characteristic Delftware vessels and tiles. Stone monastery buildings were much sought after by craftsmen who used fire in the manufacture of their products, such as glass makers. Before 1563, a contemporary historian wrote, "Fair houses in London were plenteous and very easy to be had at low and small rents, and by reason of the late dissolution of religious houses, many houses in London stood vacant, and not any man desirous to take them. Between 1550 and 1700, the population of London grew from 80,000 to over 500,000. Wow. In 1500 it was a national capital inhabited by only 4% of the English population. By 1700 it had become a major metropolis with almost 10%. The resultant pressure on housing in the already overcrowded medieval city necessitated massive building in areas such as the West End, within easy reach of the Royal Court at Whitehall, and outward into the suburbs. Buildings and alleys covered a wide area of former fields east of the city, fanning out from the existing ribbon developments on the approach roads and rural hamlets." Now we have a picture here. It's a painting, and it depicts the coronation procession of King Edward VI in 1547. A traditional route was followed from the Tower of London to Westminster, and the way was lined with specially constructed viewing stands from which city liverymen viewed the procession. So landmarks passed on the way: St Mary le Bow, St Paul's, Ludgate and Charing Cross are all clearly visible. The rural suburb of Southwark on the south bank of the river forms the background. So there's the Tower of London. Okay. This growth is even more remarkable because it was frequently checked by the ravages of plague. Nearly a quarter of the city's inhabitants died of plague in 1563. In 1665, more than 80% of people died, a figure equivalent to the combined 17th century populations of Norwich, Bristol, Newcastle, York and Exeter. Plague was concentrated both socially and geographically. Rats and fleas spread the disease throughout overcrowded alleys, shacks and tenements. Graveyards were soon overflowing, and new burial grounds had to be established to take the strain. Though the city authorities had attempted to was added to by Henry VIII, the cockpit, tennis courts, and an area for pageants, and by Charles I. Former residents of bishops and priors along the Strand were appropriated by prominent nobles and courtiers. New buildings erected on land lying between the city and Westminster were now largely built in brick. James I was determined the 16th century. The ditch surrounding the city walls was also filled in over much of its length by the encroachment of new buildings and streets. London still had a noble skyline of church spires, though the greatest of all at St. Paul's had been removed after being hit by lightning in 1561. The city was studded with fine buildings, royal palaces, civic halls and parish churches, besides the Tower of London. There were 2 royal palaces in London in Tudor and Stuart period. Baynard's Castle on the waterfront between Queenhithe and the Fleet was rebuilt in 1501 by Henry VII as a royal residence in the city. The ambitions of Henry VIII went much further, for his apartments at the Tower and at Westminster had both been destroyed by fire early in his reign, and he was therefore looking for a site on which to build a palace fit for a European prince. Bridewell Palace was built between 1515 and about 1523. Though positioned in the middle of a built-up area south of Fleet Street, its site was of a suitable size because the buildings were raised largely on reclaimed land at the confluence of the Fleet and Thames. Like the contemporary palace at Hampton Court in Middlesex, it was meant to be approached principally from the river. London's civic buildings and amenities were constantly being improved during the 16th and early 17th century West End. It housed a growing army of craftsmen and semi-skilled workers who serviced the trade and wealthy population of the capital, living in an altogether shabbier area dominated by manual work and with few residential amenities. Such workers grew rapidly in numbers and helped increase London's population threefold in the course of the century. It was here that the shipwrights and sailors settled who made London's growth as a centre of overseas trade possible. The social tone of the area was very different to that in the West. At the time Stowe wrote his survey, London was undergoing momentous change. The capital was bursting its medieval bounds, and impelled by the growth of capitalist enterprise and supported by large-scale immigration from the rest of England which was later subdivided in this way to make space for smaller houses closely packed. There was little, if any, adjacent private open space in the city centre. The growth of London and the new squares. London in the 16th century saw very marked population growth in the parishes which fell outside the city walls. The pressure on existing housing which this created resulted in the appearance of a new generation of buildings and alleys which were spread over a wide area of former fields in the east of the city, fanning out from the ribbon developments which already flanked the approach roads into London. Much of this building took place in previously rural hamlets, especially Ratcliffe, Limehouse, Shoreditch, Whitechapel and around St. Catherine's Hospital. In this piecemeal way, the East End of London was born. So again, this map shows the Thames, London Bridge, St. Paul's, so it's the growth of 17th century London. Although open space to the north and west of the city was still being used for animal grazing and cultivation, these activities were also being gradually forced out to Islington and surrounding villages as development began to fill in the fields and open spaces which lay outside the city walls. So I think this purple line is the city walls here, so you can see the expansion. The village of Clerkenwell, for instance, was absorbed by the northern spread of the city. So let's see, there's Clerkenwell. By the end of the 16th century, in the wake of the dissolution of the monasteries, bishops and priors had been ejected from their fashionable mansions along the Strand. A string of residences built for nobles and courtiers, such as Essex House, Arundel House and Salisbury House, replaced them. By the 1630s, the Crown had abandoned its attempts to prevent expansion and now sought to limit growth by allowing only those developments which reached certain standards. In this way, areas such as Covent Garden and Lincoln's Inn, spacious squares flanked by elegant houses for gentlemen and aristocrats, came to be built. The principal architect of this revolutionary new look was Inigo Jones, a Londoner by birth, but heavily influenced by the Italian Renaissance and the architecture of Palladio. Over the next 20 70